Please join me in welcoming Royce as he guides us through the changes of the Rivoli, Art Deco survivor from the golden age of cinema.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about such a fantastic building as the Rivoli. The Rivoli actually holds a special place in the history of Melbourne's cinemas. It was the last of Melbourne's large luxury cinemas to be opened at the start of the Second World War. It's always been renowned for its Art Deco styling, both externally and internally. Its conversion to an 8-cinema building resulted in what has been called the world's first Art Deco cinema complex. My talk will focus on the theatre's journey from the large single-screen building of 1940 to the complex of 8 screens that we have today. I'll also talk about what it was like to go to the pictures in those days, as it was a very different experience to the modern one. Actually, the history of the Rivoli starts long before 1940. Robert McLeish was one of Melbourne's most enterprising cinema operators. He was born in 1883, and his singing in his church choir led to a career on the stage as a singer. He toured with many shows and appeared in the Melbourne Tivoli. In 1905, he released the Paran Town Hall and presented a mix of vaudeville and film 6 nights a week. He added 5 more town halls to his circuit. He then borrowed money to enable him to purchase or lease the Northcote Theatre in 1912, and from then on he concentrated on films. By 1920 he controlled 3 theatres and was ready to build his first Rivoli. Camberwell's existing picture theatre, locally known as Holland's after its proprietor, was in Burke Road, almost next door to the first Rivoli, and it had opened in 1914. It was already appearing old-fashioned by the time the Rivoli opened in 1921. The new theatre was an immediate success. McLeish continued to prosper, and by 1928 he was advertising in the Hoyt's magazine Screen News. His chain at that time consisted of 5 theatres. You can see them on the top half of there. Interestingly, the Newmarket and the Rivoli original one are both gone. The Northcote is still there. The Austral in Collingwood has been a carpet warehouse for about 40 years, but it is very much on the way out now. It's under an order to have a complete demolition, but it's been stayed for a short time. And the Fairfield Theatre is the other one listed there, and it's actually has been the newsagent in the main street of Fairfield for quite some years, so some of those are still there. The only real competition for the Rivoli was Hoyt's Broadway. That opened as our theatre in June 1921, only 5 weeks after the Rivoli. It was further up Burke Road on the same side, just north of the railway line, near the crest of the Camberwell Hill. It was taken over by Hoyt's in 1927, and the name soon changed to the Broadway. Due to distribution arrangements with the studios, Hoyt's chain showed mainly 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers movies, and the independent theatres such as the Rivoli screened MGM and Paramount movies, so there was never the competition that there is today. Both cinemas coexisted happily and attracted large audiences through the peak of cinema going for the next 30 years. By the mid-1930s, existing cinemas were looking a bit staid and old-fashioned. The new trend overseas, particularly in the USA, saw Art Deco evolve into Art Moderne with much more streamlined architecture. A series of cinemas were built in Melbourne in this style, mostly by Royce, from 1936. McLeish joined this trend when, in conjunction with Hoyt's Theatres, he built the ultra-modern Regal Cinema in Hartwell at the intersection of Camberwell Road and Toorak Road. It opened in May 1937. It was a very imposing looking building on a corner site, which unfortunately doesn't survive today. By the late 1930s, McLeish's son Robert Jr. was also very involved in the business. In 1940, they were inspired by a surge in cinema attendances and decided to upgrade their presence in Camberwell with a building worthy of a city theatre. They engaged the architectural firm of H.B. Taylor and Solo, who had been responsible for 6 of Melbourne's most notable modern cinemas of the late 1930s. The Rivoli has usually been referred to as being in Camberwell, but the actual address is Camberwell Road, East Hawthorn. Early references also described its location as Upper Hawthorn, but its proximity to Camberwell Junction resulted in it usually being advertised as Camberwell, or sometimes Camberwell Junction. The new theatre opened with much fanfare on October the 12th, 1940. The Argus that day hailed it as the most modern picture theatre in the Commonwealth. The new Rivoli was probably the last theatre of its type to open in Melbourne. Australia had already been at war for more than a year and was soon to face huge shortages of labour and building materials, a position they didn't recover from until the early 1950s. The opening was well covered in the daily press and specialist publications such as the Architectural Magazine Building and RCA Photophone News Magazine that this page comes from. The photos at the bottom of the page are particularly interesting today. The photo on the right is quite different to how it is now, as the auditorium was split in two when the theatre was twinned in 1968, and I'll have more about that later. The size and shape of the screen also changed considerably with the introduction of CinemaScope in 1954. The wall on the photo in the left is actually as spectacular today as it was then. The theatre originally seated 1,004 patrons in the stalls and 640 in the dress circle upstairs, 304 of those in lounge chairs. For the openings of these great theatres in the late 30s, the owners produced quite elaborate programs, and we're lucky to have several in the Kath's archive. The program for the Rivoli describes the experience that would have been enjoyed by patrons in those days. There's a few things there which you don't see these days. They found it necessary to mention ventilation because air conditioning wasn't really well known in those days, so they particularly draw attention to the fact that it was well ventilated. Free parking, which has always been a problem. There was a bit of a park on the side of it. Deaf aids, I'm not quite sure what the deaf aid actually was, but they made a big point of saying that they were catering to the deaf people in the district. And a pram park. We don't see very many pram parks in theatres these days either. And the admissions prices are also interesting, totally out of touch with today, but a shilling was the cheapest one in the stalls, up to 2 and 3, where you got one of those lounge chairs that I mentioned before. The entrance foyer was particularly impressive. This always amuses me. I don't know how many people turned up dressed like that. Just about all of the programs for the theatres, the ladies were in evening dress and men even had tails, so I'm not quite sure about that. It is a very interesting bit, and they had a terrazzo floor and a ticket box in the centre of the entrance. And the circular staircase you can see in the centre at the back, which is still a feature of the foyer for the Rivoli. Here's our well-dressed patrons sitting in front of that wall again. relaxing in their luxurious surroundings and armchair comfort. The opening program was typical of that time. Audiences were shown a newsreel and then a short, such as in this one, with the Our Gang comedies, which had been very popular. They lasted for about 10 minutes. Then B-grade, second feature. After interval, there was a travelogue, followed by the main feature. The program always ended with the audience standing for the national anthem, God Save the King. The crying room was a special feature of most of the theatres of the late 30s, and that's very unusual too. It was soundproof, had about 20 seats, and Mother could still enjoy the theatre and the movie, and probably the rest of the audience may have been able to do it as well, because nobody could hear the little darlings. And the matinees were extremely popular at the time too. They usually showed cartoons, westerns or adventure films, and a serial with a cliffhanger ending which had the kiddies coming back next week to see whether the heroine survived, which she usually did. The spacious roof garden was a feature of the Rivoli. It opened off the circle foyer through a series of double doors, a pool and a tall illuminated fountain with the central features of the roof garden. Once again, the men are extremely overdressed in their tows, standing out in the cold night air in Camberwell. The roof garden is still there, and it is open again now as well. It opens off in the new part of the theatre. The next photos were taken at the time of opening, and they were published in a Rivoli calendar in 1996. It's interesting to compare them with the images in the opening program. This was the visit from that calendar. The ticket box is still there in the main entrance on the terrazzo floor. It was later moved, but it can still be seen there. That's a later photo that I took, and you can see on the floor in the semicircle there where the ticket box stood. As we'll also see later, that was carpeted during a later renovation in the 60s, and it wasn't until the theatre was renovated or almost rebuilt in the early 2000s that the terrazzo floor was again able to be seen. There's a view looking back. It was the old style of screen before CinemaScope, and on the left of the screen you can see the organ. They had a organist playing usually before and at interval, live theatre organ music. Here it was always on the stage there, it didn't rise up out of the floor like they did in some of the theatres. There's a photo of the stalls again, and the window on the left-hand side, the square window, that was the crying room, so that was where Mum was able to watch the movie. This photo of the roof garden would have been taken a few years later, I think, than the previous photos. It was probably after a 1992 renovation, which included the addition of a new fountain. There's a photo that I took of it as it is now, so the roof garden is still there and able to be enjoyed, and it adjoins a bar area. Apart from Royce, who ran about 40 theatres, there were two independent groups of suburban theatres who shared advertising and sometimes switched movies with each other. This ad's from the mid-1940s, and it shows the group that included the McLeish theatres who were in that earlier ad. The Ball and the St Kilda Palais are the only ones of all those cinemas that are still operating, and in most cases the buildings were demolished long ago. The double bill that was in that ad would have attracted large audiences. Rita Hayworth was extremely popular at that time in the war. Gene Kelly was only in his 6th film and he didn't even rate his picture on the poster. So that changed a little bit later on. The supporting feature was Basil Rathbone in Spider-Woman, the Sherlock Holmes one. That series was very popular, and although it was a support here, that was sometimes screened as the main film. The program always had an interval, and the theatres had boys in uniform who walked around the auditorium selling ice cream and chocolates. As it says, called the uniform service boy. And this is a glass slide which would have been screened at the interval along with others advertising the local businesses. A lot of cinemas also had their own candy bars, as there was a good profit margin in those sales. Interestingly, Peter's ice cream was still sold at the Rivoli some 80 years later. Pass-outs were issued at the interval for patrons wishing to leave the building for a smoke or to visit the shops. This photo is from the early 1940s. The coffee lounge and chocolate shop next door would have done very good business from the theatre patrons. If you were lucky, a packet of fantails was always popular at the interval. You could sit and read the biographies of the movie stars on the wrappers, and they had a photo of the film star on the back of each box too, which I remember collecting way back when I was a kid. If it was a really special occasion, or he was trying to impress you, there may be a packet of scorched almonds or even a box of chocolates. And there's a few memories in that box, I think. This is a great photo with the Rivoli showing the very popular Laurence Olivier movie Hamlet, which won the Best Picture and Best Actor Oscars for 1948. This is the Australian poster for Hamlet, which was probably displayed at the theatre. The Australian censorship classification down there for general exhibition. Laurence Olivier got another job in 1953 when he narrated a documentary on the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Australia was very English at that time, and the coronation produced many special issues of newspapers, magazines and books. Before the introduction of television, the only way to see any moving footage of such events was at the pictures, where a newsreel was always screened. This film had an exclusive release at the State Theatre in the city. The suburbs were then able to show it too on a strictly limited basis. The first part of this suburban listing shows that the first theatres to show it exclusively and simultaneously with the Melbourne State were Balwyn, Kew, Glenferrie and Ivanhoe. They were also showing it at a special matinee every day, which was due to unprecedented interest. Usually the matinees were maybe midweek and on Saturdays. During the 1950s, cinemas in the Rivoli's independent group issued small monthly booklets. They detailed all the programs for the month. In 1954, widescreen cinemascope was installed. Rosemarie was MGM's first cinemascope musical. It did record business around Australia, opening in June. Anyone who grew up in suburban Melbourne in the 40s and 50s would have attended the Saturday matinee at their suburban theatre. The picture in the opening program illustrated the importance of the matinee in the weekly schedule. This advertising is from a late 1950s paper, and it seems to feature a lot of cartoons. In earlier times there was usually a western such as Hopalong Cassidy, but these had all transferred to television by this time. The Australian movie Smiley Gets a Gun always makes me smile. I don't think you'd get away with advertising that these days. No one thought to take a photo outside the Rivoli in the 1950s and send it to me, but this was the scene at Hampton, which is exactly the same as seen in Saturday afternoon all over Melbourne. Now, unfortunately, the good times of the mid-1950s weren't to last much longer. Television arrived in 1956 and had a dramatic and almost immediate effect on Melbourne's cinema industry. Suburban cinemas had recorded a drastic decline in about 2 years, and in 1960 their number had fallen from 127 to 67. Many more of those closed in the next couple of years. In 1961, Melbourne households had more than 400,000 television sets. By 1970, Melbourne only had 44 cinemas in the suburbs. This ad from 1968 illustrates this. The independent cinema listings we saw earlier had shrunk to 5 theatres up in the top corner there under regional. Royce, which had more than 40 theatres in the suburbs, was reduced to 5 indoors in addition to their drive-ins. Interestingly, Camberwell remained an area which could still sustain its 2 theatres. My Fair Lady was still doing good business at the Rivoli in 70mm on stereophonic sound, and up the hill the Broadway was also attracting good audiences. That continued to do so until 1979, when Royce decided to close all their remaining suburban theatres. Village Roadshow purchased a half share in the Rivoli in 1968. This photo from soon after that date shows the village name in that at the top of that horizontal sign. The most dramatic change since opening occurred later in 1968, when the Rivoli was divided into 2 auditoria by extending the upstairs dress circle forward, creating one cinema above the other. The twin cinemas opened on December 26th in 1968. Cinema 1 seated 732 and Cinema 2 seated 450. This was the opening program. The choice of movie is interesting. In keeping with the art house theme which they had been moving towards through the 60s to differentiate them from the chains, they had a French feature in the smaller cinema and a Russian production of War and Peace in Cinema 1. This ran for 6.5 hours and was screened as 2 separate films. The theatre then was known as the Rivoli Twin. There's the foyer. The renovation involved carpeting the foyer and the stairs. Somehow I think it loses quite a bit of its look without that terrazzo floor, but that has come back. In 1981, Village bought the remaining 50% share of the theatre from the McLeish family, and they continue to run it today. In 1982 and again in 1994, they attempted to add further cinemas, but the applications were refused by council, mainly due to insufficient car parking. Then we got really dramatic. In 1999, Village announced a $14 million expansion to add 6 more screens. It closed in April of that year and was set to reopen in December, but construction dragged on until May 2000. The wait proved worthwhile and the enlarged cinema was well received. The new 3-storey extension housed 4 new cinemas seating between 82 and 262 seats. The extension was very cleverly designed so as not to overpower the original building but to complement it. The brochures that they put out at the time showed how proud they were of their new theatre. Once again, the circular wall decoration features in all their advertising. That's the ad for the opening of the new theatre. And they got much publicity for that. That's the new building, the original cinema. Village then looked on the Rivoli as the finest cinema in Melbourne, and they then started using it for premieres and prestigious screenings. That's the foyer. Premiere of Moulin Rouge. They actually had Nicole Kidman and Baz Luhrmann there, and the revamped Cinema 1, built in the dress circle of the 1940 building, and Cinemas 2 and 3 all showed the film simultaneously. There's a couple of shots inside. That was with the after it had been split, that original screen, and that's looking from the stage back to the bio box. It's still quite spectacular. These 2006 photos of Cinema One showed it was such a fitting venue for that type of occasion. During that year it hosted another premiere with Harrison Ford, direct from Hollywood, for his latest movie, Firewall. And there he is signing autographs in Camberwell. Moving with the times, they moved into gold class in 2011. That included new dining and bar areas and a refurbished rooftop terrace. Another nod to the original building. In another note to the past, Quentin Tarantino's hit movie The Hateful Eight was screened in 70mm screen. Prior to the COVID disruption, the cinema premiered another new Australian movie, Palm Beach. After the lifting of COVID restrictions, I took this photo. The sign on there, on the front, says the message, "Welcome back to the movies." It certainly proves that the current modern Rivoli sits perfectly in the Camberwell streetscape, and the art modern building of 1940 has continued to amaze subsequent generations. Only 3 weeks ago it was the venue for the Melbourne premiere of the latest big hit, Barbie. So now it's time to call the boy and enjoy a hygienic bucket of Peters. Or if you can't find him, please enjoy a cup of coffee with us.